All right, so we will go ahead and get started. We've got quite a few people joining in as well. You should all be able to see the presentation now. Welcome to the final webinar of the 2020 webinar series for CITAR India. I'm smiling because I can't believe we've reached the end. It's been a crazy, crazy year, and so proud of what we have put together over the course of this year as far as our webinars are concerned. And what a fantastic way to end the series this year with a special presentation on the international empire, the Cholas in medieval times, with our speaker, Pradeep Chakravarthy. I'm going to hand it over to Lakshmi in just a moment to introduce him. But before we do that, there are just a few quick things. It's lovely to see everyone on video this morning, this afternoon, and this evening. Once Pradeep begins to speak, we would ask that you switch the video off just to avoid the distraction. And please do keep yourself on mute. This is a 45-minute illustrated talk, and there will be a 15-minute Q&A at the end as well. So you'll be welcome to switch your video back on during the Q&A. We'll put the tiles up and everyone can see everybody for the final 15 minutes of the session. So just a quick reminder to switch off your video. You can do that now, or you can do that as soon as Pradeep begins to speak. As far as the chat is concerned, at any point in time, if you have a question or a comment, you are free to use chat. We will all be moderating. Those of us on the CITAR board will be moderating the chat and making sure that those comments and questions get addressed with Pradeep as well. About a minute before we close, we would ask that you fill out the feedback survey. So I'll put a link in the chat box right at the end. And I would appreciate feedback that we can also provide to Pradeep as a thank you for being here and presenting for CITAR today. But that will be right at the end, just before we close. Those are all of the sort of agreements for today's webinar. And again, a warm welcome to everyone who's just coming in. Thank you so much. I'm going to hand it over to Lakshmi now, who's going to do our introduction of our speaker.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you so much for this good start. Good evening, good morning, I guess not late night. And namaste and a very, very warm welcome to the last webinar of 2020. For all our, feeling of the terrible year that's gone by, it also gave us a lot of opportunities that we actually could do more webinars that we haven't been able to do in the other years. So amidst all the feelings, the feeling of gratitude that we are all healthy and safe is what really stays on. So I have immense pleasure to introduce Pradeep Chakravarthy. My first meeting with Pradeep is, I think, quite a memorable one. I was in one of those very, very nice the heritage travels, and I remember him opening the first thing that we all sat in the bus, and we thought it's going to be one hell of a fun travel, which it was eventually. But he actually opened the map. We were going to Madurai, and started to talk about actually the historical context. And I followed him in another trip. I remember when we were in Vellore and vintage Vellore, he stood there and read out the notes from the Vellore mutiny and really connecting the dots of history to the current context. And since then, I have been absolute admirer of his depth. This guy can talk, sing, and talk about cuisine that are there in the literature, and just look at the timeline. And I think that's quite fascinating for me. A historian can present his bio CV in a way that it's very, very clearly in a timeline and a context. And great speaker and author, and someone who connects the world of corporate, social, educational, cultural, religious, mythological context, we couldn't have asked for a better speaker than this. So thank you, Pradeep. Thank you, and very, very warm welcome to you. Yeah, I mean, I thought I don't have to read it out. Just look at the visual presentation of what he's been up to. Yeah, thank you.
Thank
Over to you, Pradeep.
Thank you very much. And Lakshmi, if I can request you, when I start talking about the Cholas or the Romanovs, I tend to go way above time. So if you can give me a heads up, 15 minutes before our Q&A, that'll be most
Okay.
helpful.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot for
Okay. Yeah.
that. Let me just get my PPT sorted out. If you can give me a minute.
And it's possible that I can get so lost in your, taking us back to the journey. So I will keep some kind of an alarm. Okay.
That'll be good too. Lovely. So can you all see my first slide?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I'll take questions at the end. So if all of you can go on mute, that would be helpful. And I hope all of you can see my slide. Today's talk is going to be about the Cholas, and we have a bonus thrown in for those of you who love Russian history as well. I wanted to start with this picture. So it shows you that there was a time in life when I did have a lot of black hair on my head, and I had a lot of hair on my head to start with. That's me, the little boy in the front. My connection to history is very different from most other people's connection to history. All of us learn it in school. Many of us learn it as a subject because we have to learn it because it's often irrelevant for us. I mean, really, why do we need to know which king died when, which king fought with which king, who ruled from what time to what time? And a lot of the chronology is something that is frankly irrelevant for most of us in history when we study history. My understanding of history was very different. I grew up I was born in a village or in a town called Palengote, which is about, well, 12 hours drive from Chennai. So those of you who can spot it on the map, it's really deep, deep down south. Many people in Tamil Nadu, which is the state that I come from in southern India, would have probably never visited that place either. And I was fortunate to spend my summer vacation with my maternal grandparents. That's both of them seated on the chairs, in a home that had been in our family for 6 generations. I was the sixth generation in the home. It was about 10,000 square feet, which is massive by any standards. It started at one end of the street and it finished at the other end. This man, you can't see him properly over here, but this man was my ancestor who lived for just 45 or 50 years. And he was a very, very successful lawyer. And he made a lot of money. And it meant that all his succeeding generations, and in those days, they didn't have much family planning as it was in any part of the world. So each couple would have 6, 7, sometimes even 10 kids. So you do the math, yeah, 6 generations, very wealthy, all of them sitting at home looking after the land that they bought from this one man's earning. Now, one convention in our family was that if anything was broken or if anything was not fit for use or was not in use anyway, they wouldn't throw it out of the home. They would actually fling it upstairs. So the upstairs was about 5,000 square feet of massive rooms, each of which had about 30 feet, 25 feet ceilings. And they were filled with junk that belonged to these 6 generations of people. And it could be anything. It could be vessels, it could be furniture, it could be toys, it could be clothes, newspapers, you name it, it was there upstairs in various stages of dilapidation. And for me, every summer when I went there, from about 1 o'clock in the afternoon to about 3, I was allowed to go and rummage in these rooms and do anything that I wanted, so long as I didn't make a noise and I didn't wake up the people downstairs who were having a nap. And when I came into this very different connection of history, it was more a family history. And I realized that I knew the names of so many of my ancestors. In fact, I remember in school, we had to do a project on tracing our family tree. And many people couldn't do it for more than 3 generations. And I could do like a whole chart paper. And there were still names because I knew all these names from the books and things. And I noticed that many of them didn't like math, like the way I didn't like math. Many of them were doodling on their pages like I used to doodle. and these are all in the 1890s, in the 1900s, 1920s. So I got a very different sense of history compared to what most of us have. So there were many things that were similar, which I could relate to as a boy growing up in the 1980s. There were many things that were different, but yet very similar in some way. So I wanted to kind of underscore that point by putting up this advertisement over here. This is an advertisement that came up in a magazine in about the 1850s, and this is an advertisement which is older than yourselves, your parents, your grandparents, and probably your great grandparents as well. This is an astrologer in Ceylon or Sri Lanka who is selling his wares. And he says, and these are talismans. So he says, for honor, riches, learning, and greatness, 7 rupees, 8 annas. 7 rupees is not much today. I think it's about 90 rupees for a sterling pound, and maybe around 40, 50 rupees for a dollar. I'm not sure of the exchange rate today. But in the 1850s, 7 rupees would be far, far, far more than what most people would earn in about 3 years, or even 2 years, definitely around 2 years. So it was a massive amount of money. Yeah. And so imagine, for a talisman for honor, riches, and learning was 7 rupees, 8 annas. Health and physical strength, 7 rupees, 8 annas again. Power of eloquence and speeches, that's certainly something that I need for today, 7 rupees, 8 annas. And if you go down the list, you will find for men's love to women, 7 rupees, 8 annas. And for women's love to men, 10 rupees. And my nephews and nieces, who are much more updated in the dating world with Tinder and apps like that, or they go to a lot of pubs, they tell me that things haven't changed, because even today, apparently in the dating scene, women have a better deal than men. So jokes apart, the point that I'm trying to really make out of this newspaper advertisement that came about, 1855, which is more than 100 years back, is that fundamentally, as human beings, human nature has not changed. Our needs, our fears, our aspirations, whether they were a thousand years ago, whether they're today or whether they're tomorrow, are pretty much the same. We all want health. We all want wealth. We all want respect. We all want eloquence. We all want affection, and many, many other things. So that's really the big point that I want to make, which is our needs as human beings, or even living things, are eternal and universal. We have people in this call from Canada, from Europe, from maybe from Australia as well. Sure, they might not know the same language. They might have different customs. You might have been educated in different places. The food may be different. But fundamentally, as human beings, our needs and our fears are eternal and universal. So regardless of whether we are currently living, whether it is our ancestors whom we don't even know, whether it is our descendants whom we also will never know, our basic needs as human beings are very, very similar. And if we start looking at history from this perspective of basic needs, why did this king do something like this? What could have been his need? What could have been his fear that he was operating from? That can help us understand how we are executing our needs, or are operating from our fears, and that might give us some insight into whether what we're doing is going to be of long-standing value, whether it will help us in living to our fullest potential. So this is really the big idea that I want to pass on to you. I could even call it a lens. So the rest of what we're going to look at today is going to be really just two dynasties from this lens, and you can apply it not just to the kings and queens from your countries or from your cultures, but you can apply it to yourself as well, your own role models in your family, yourself as well in the past. So it's not just the history of countries that we can apply this to, but history to ourselves as well. And that becomes a very powerful tool for us to understand, for the sake of what are we doing certain things, for the sake of what are we thinking certain things or speaking certain things, and how is this going to help us achieve our needs, or reduce our fears. This is a question that I'd like you to answer and keep in your mind. You don't need to share the answer. How many years would you like to be remembered in your organization after you leave, or by your clients, or if you want to, you could even say by your loved ones around you. So I'm going to wait for a second or two and get each of you to think of a number. And you don't need to share this with anybody. And remember, infinity is not a number, it's only a concept. Cool. So I hope all of you have a number in your mind. And this is why I wanted you to think of that number. This is the map of India, as you can see. The eastern coast of India is called the Coromandel Coast. This was a name that we got from the British, but it's an anglicized version of the older word, which is Chola Mandala. Chola is the name of a kingdom, which we're going to learn a little bit more about. Mandala literally means a very large parcel of land. So call it a province or a state or a district. It's a very large parcel of land. Now, the reason that it's surprising that this place is called Cholamandala, so there's the entire part, so that could include Tamil Nadu, which is where I come from. It could include Andhra, Telangana, Orissa, Bihar, West Bengal, a little bit. All of these are are states within the Indian Union, and this branch, this is what the coast is called. Now, many rulers, greatest rulers of India have ruled this place, and yet it is after the Cholas that we remember it today. And that becomes a reason for us to observe what the Cholas may have done, because even 2000 years after they're no longer there, we still remember their name, we still remember their contribution, and we've actually called the eastern coast of India after them. And I think this will go back to the exercise that you did earlier. I'm sure your numbers would have been either below 2000 or little maybe after 2000. Therefore, if you have that number in mind, it becomes helpful for us to look at what the Cholas did in order to leave a legacy that they are remembered today, even after 2000 years. Um, Today, when we talk about success, the quantity becomes a very important parameter, right? It could be if an organization, it could be how many branches do you have, how many customers do you service, how many employees do you have. If it could be a school, it could be maybe how many students do you have, how many programs have you done, and if in any of the institutions of a people like me who are in facilitation, it could be how many clients do I have, how many workshops do I do in a week, how many hours do I build. So quantity becomes a very important target for all of us. And you can see that if you look at the Chola Empire, and this is the extent of the empire about 1,000 years back. And it's actually much larger than the geographical boundaries of India today. And even today, the name still exists. Malaysia, for example, has a province or a state called Kedah. And the root word for Kedah is an old Chola word, which is Kadaram. Cambodia, for example, is Kambuja, which was the old Chola name. Bali, for example, continues to be Hindu in Indonesia, largely because of the Chola presence as well. So you can see that the Chola Empire, when it came to the metric of quantity, clearly they had a massive enough empire for us to learn something from them. Well, quantity is one thing. Quality is also something that's equally important. So, and quality here is about getting stuff done in the right way. And this is a fabulous temple that one of the greatest Chola kings built. This is in a village or in a town called Tanjavur, which is about 5 hours from Chennai, which is the city that I live in. The central tower is about 230 feet tall, and it's entirely hollow inside. So the stones are constructed in such a way that each stone rests on the other, and the capstone on the top is 8 pieces, which brings the structure together. Every stone is granite, which is much harder to carve than marble, which is what we usually see in European cathedrals, for example, at least in Italy. And granite was also not locally found. So it was got from about 120 kilometers away through river. And it's remarkable that they did all this. And every piece of stone in this structure has no binding material. And there are no careless mistakes. There are no errors. Every joint is a perfect right angle. There's absolute symmetry. And the miracle is that all of this was done with just a hammer and a chisel. This was done about 1,000 years back when there was no earth moving equipment, when there were no qualified civil engineers. These are all great engineers who had that bent of mind, that attention to detail, and they could create something of outstanding quality in the toughest materials, in the most complicated way in logistics, and they were able to do something perfect. And some of you might say, okay, it's about the great things, but what about the small things as well? And again, over there, you see in another Chola temple, I've kept a car key for comparison. Such a small sculpture, again carved out of granite, which is an extremely dense stone, very difficult to carve. Enormous attention to detail, right down to the creepers over here. This creeper is actually become a very stylized lion's head, or a yali is actually a mythical beast. It's halfway through a lion and an elephant, so you can just about see the eyes, and you can see the mouth opening up, and here there's another mouth opening up, and the creeper continues and it ends with another mouth. So it's phenomenal attention to detail. This is a little dwarf, not like the cherub of the Baroque period, but we have these called Bhutaganas, and they are actually denizens or members of an army of one of our Hindu gods. And as you can see, he is having a merry dance, enjoying himself. And there's another one of his friends playing a percussion instrument, another one over here playing a percussion instrument. And you can just about see, despite all the erosion of 1,000 years, you can still see a very winsome smile where he's enjoying the dance. So here's an empire that was a truly Southeast Asian global empire in terms of quantity. They were able to build fabulous products in the most with enormous limitations, and yet they were able to focus on attention to detail as well. Now, fortunately for the Cholas, we have several inscriptions or epigraphs on the walls. So it's just like Egyptian hieroglyphs, we have in the Chola period almost all the Chola temples that were built, and we have about more than 20,000 of them, including some in Sri Lanka as well. Almost all of them have these kind of inscriptions on the wall. These are usually in Tamil, which is the language of Tamil Nadu, where I come from and where the Cholas ruled from. 100% of these inscriptions are completely non-religious. We have no references to mythology or philosophy. All of them are administrative, political, social, economic, and judicial records. So I think what you need to understand here is anything today we would maybe put on a company website, right, as important laws. Anything that we might have as a government publication in those days was put up on the temple wall, because everything that you expect the government to do in the local community today, the temple did for the local community. And investing in the temple and making the temple work as the representative of the government in the local community was a way of delegation of the king's responsibility of ruling, so that each community would be as self-sufficient as possible. The point that's important here is for us to move away from looking at temples or churches or mosques as religious institutions, but also look at them as institutions. And why not? Because temples or religious institutions also employ people. They also have an employee cost. They also have a revenue. They also have a product launch. So in a way, every festival is like a product launch. They also have a top line and a bottom line. And therefore, if we start looking at, and this is an image for those of you who haven't been to India. This is an image of a temple festival in India, and you can see it's massively crowded. There's the central processional image of the deity, and he has a golden umbrella under him, and is one of the most important and wealthy temples. We'll come to him a little bit later. So if we start looking at institutions as religious institutions, as institutions first, especially in the Chola period, where we have all their economic, social, political, administrative records, then when all of these are about disputes that are being resolved, it's about the king making orders about tax collection or tax rebates, it's about irrigation disputes being decided, we start getting an idea of what are the fundamental principles of the Chola Empire. And that's really what we're going to look at in terms of the reason for them being one of Asia or one of the world's first earliest international dynasties. Were they financially efficient? Yes, the Cholas were. These are two. This is a Chola coin. It actually looks much larger in the picture. It must be the size of your pinky fingers, fingernail. That's all it will be. Just about less a centimeter or two. This man here is Rajaraja Chola. He was the one who built the big temple that I showed you a couple of slides earlier. And these coins were considered legal tender for more than 300 years after he died. I just want to give you a perspective that not only in quantity, in quality, in attention to detail, in financial metrics as well, so the Cholas are something that we can learn from. So when we look at the Chola uh, records of administration, there are, and most of them are about disputes being resolved. There are two or three principles that shine forth, and it is these three principles that have helped them become such a important dynasty for such a long period in the medieval times. And my belief is that, and my invitation to you is that you make a note of what these three beliefs are, what the actions are, and look at how you can incorporate them into your own life so that you can also leave a legacy as powerful, as meritorious as the Cholas have. Let's come down to the first legacy. Now, this is a temple which is not very far off from the place that I came from. And there are other temples like this as well. Now, two of these temples, one in a village called Utramerur, which is not very far off from where I'm speaking now, and one which is in Manur, which is a much further off. There are two inscriptions on the local community of a village in about 1500 years ago, deciding to change the rules for electing local members of the administrative committee for the village. And in those days, in the village, the administrative committee functioned both as a judiciary as well as a legislature. Now, imagine even in the US, which is highly federal, it is inconceivable for a state, or let alone a state, a village to sit together and decide, hey, this is going to be the way we are going to run elections in our country, right? I'm sure maybe after these recent elections, many people want to do that in the US, but it's inconceivable in even the most federal structures to expect something like this. And you would be amazed to note that 1500 years back, there were villages which were allowed to actually change the rules of elections by themselves. Manur is from about the 8th century. Utramerur is from about the 10th or the 11th century. And you can imagine what a earth-shattering change this would be even in today's age. Many people believe in India that the democracy was a gift that the British gave us. Not really true. We've had a democratic tradition even before that. I won't go into the details of the election because we're running short of time, but I can just give you one example. If I was a member of the Legislative Assembly for a 2-year term, and usually the terms are 2 years, 13 different kinds of my relatives cannot stand for election in the next term. And compare this with the family hold that politicians have in many countries today, and make a decision for yourself on whether democracy has regressed or has it progressed. Number one. The second is, in the Legislative Assembly, if I consistently veto or do filibustering of important proposals, I will be fined money. Again, compare this with the way our legislated representatives behave in parliament, and you can decide for yourself whether we have progressed as a democracy or we have regressed. So, and you will find many other examples like this, but the fundamental premise in terms of a decision made between the king and the local assembly is that I am different, you are different. Our needs, our skills, and our capabilities are different, which is why the king's job was only to collect taxes and only to ensure that there was no civil war or there was no external aggression. Everything else was allowed by the local community to decide. So very often in organizations, I find a lot of no love lost between the corporate office and the plants or the regional offices. And the fundamental reason for that is that corporate offices tend to become more centralized rather than decentralized. And this was something that enabled the Cholas to manage an empire of scale, that they were able to trust the local villages, but they had very strict reasons. So we've had cases of where people have committed suicide because the Chola tax collector was ruthless. So when it came to collecting taxes, when it came to ensuring that there was no internal civil or internal or external rebellion, the Cholas were ruthless. But apart from that, everything else that was not connected to this was pushed down to the local level, because they believed that people are different, and the more autonomy we give, the more we delegate, the more we trust the local person to do what is right for them, the more sustainable our legacy will be, the more we can hold on to our large empire. And the other example that I want to give, this may actually resonate a lot more with people in India, um, is in India we have multiple gods, and all our gods have some festival or the other. Now, it might be a very efficient way to think of festivals by doing the same thing for all gods, but we have very different customs for each of these festivals, and that goes back to a philosophic belief that for us, God is within each person. God is within nature. It's not that God created nature. In fact, I shouldn't even say God, because in the Hindu tradition, we some of our gods don't even have a gender, and some of them change genders as well. So the divine spirit is there within every animate and inanimate being. And as an emphasis of that, we find that our customs and rituals are also different. So they keep reminding us that people are different, our gods are different, so our people are also different. And one way is to actually work with this different rather than come down and say, no, it has to be one God, one prophet, one book, whatever, one way of doing things. So this is the first lesson from the Chola Empire's administration, where they actively encourage diversity and autonomy in diversity. The second example is from a very important and one of the world's, I think, if I'm not mistaken, this is the world's largest religious complex. It is a Srirangam temple, and you can see why it is so. Again, this main tower is about 230 feet high. If I'm not mistaken, this is the second or the third tallest structure in South Asia. And this Srirangam is actually on an island, and and this is one of our most wealthy temples. um, it has gold jewelry and diamonds, and in fact it is believed that the Hope diamond, which is now in the Smithsonian, originally was one of the eyes of the deity of of this temple. um, so this temple, because it was one of India's largest landowners at that point of time in medieval times, very frequently the Kaveri River would flood the bank. And when it flooded the bank, the land became unfit for cultivation. And because it became unfit for cultivation, what the temple will do is it will leave it out for auction. And when it left it out for auction, the highest bidder will pick up the land. And then the highest bidder will say, hey, I can't pay you the full agricultural tax from the first year, because I have to also do my bit to get the land back up to cultivation. And it will take time. So the temple will agree, and the temple will actually give him a staggered tax rate. So it will say first year you pay 1/8, second year you pay 1/7, third year maybe you pay half, fourth year you pay maybe a quarter, something like that. So it will be staggered, and eventually in the sixth year or the seventh year, the full tax rate has to be paid. The temple will also suggest to the landholder what kind of crops can be planted to maximize his output. So millets would be sown first, paddy would come later, then areca nut, which is a very important aphrodisiac for us in the old days. Betel leaves, betel nuts is what it's also called, would also be planted first round because they grow as trees and they're an important cash crop. So the temple will actively work with the farmer, give him a good deal, and when this deed is signed, and this would be signed, and the hard copy would be on the wall, it will be engraved on the wall. When the deed is signed, all the other people who have leased land from the temple will also sign as witnesses. So there's complete transparency in the deal. And the principle, and you'll find this in a lot of the Chola deals, you will find the sense of, if I help you first, you will help me second. Always it is about, in the Chola period, and if you go, I don't like to use the word mythology for our stories because we believe that they really happened. So if you look at our itihasas, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, and if you look at most of our stories, you will always find it's about what I do for the community first and not what I ask from the community. And this is a fundamental principle of an economy that thrives on the river valley. We're not a shepherding economy. We're a river valley economy. And in the river valley, if I have to cultivate paddy or wheat, paddy of course is rice. If we have to cultivate rice or wheat, I need the community much more than the community needs me. Because however wealthy I am, unlike a shepherd who can tend to his own flock, In the river valley civilization, a farmer needs the support of more people, much more, for him to achieve his harvest much more than others need it. And when we look at people who grab and never give back, they are called rakshasas. And rakshasas, in a loose way, are also called demons. This is not exclusive only to India. You will find that in every community there will be no good word to describe a person who keeps taking from others but does not give back, because the rule of reciprocity is the fundamental rule for human civilization itself, and the Cholas were no exception to this. um, and it meant that every dispute that was resolved, or every difference of opinion, they would always look at what could each give to each other before they take from each other. And I think that would be the insight that we have from the second lesson of the Cholas. And another example of this is, some of you may have not seen this. This is a well, and there's water inside. Today, most of our children believe that water comes from taps. Well, they're surprised. They will be surprised to know that we had wells at one point of time. Um, when I was a child living in that 10,000 square feet house, there was a well that was actually next to the kitchen. So the kitchen was a large room, and inside the kitchen there was a well to take water out. And many days the electricity power wouldn't work in those days, and the motor wouldn't work to pump the water up to the overhead tank. So my grandmama and I would have to actually haul the water out. Actually, my grandmama would do it, but I would help her. And we had a bucket like this at the bottom. There was no hole in the bucket. For those of you who know your Harry Belafonte song, but when my grandmother took the water out, and it would be about 6 a.m. in the morning or 7 a.m. in the morning, so that the food cooking can start, and we could get water for our bath. The first bucket of water that she took, she will pour it into the ground or into the well again. And I thought this was a very stupid thing to do. And I would tell her as much. And I'll say, look, I mean, it's so much of effort, drawing the water out. Why would you throw the first one in? And her answer would always be the same. It would be that, well, I only when I pour the water back into the well, I remember that the water does not belong to me. It actually belongs to the well. So when I pour it back into the well, I am in a way indicating to the well, or telling the well that, hey, this is water that you have gifted me out of your generosity, and it behoves me to use it carefully, because if I abuse that water that day, there's a good chance that when I put the bucket in the next day, there may not be water inside. And I think for all of us today who are struggling with the efforts of global warming and desertification and droughts, this is a classic lesson that we need to learn today. That it is not only with people, but with nature as well. We need to look at what we can give to nature first before we start saying what can we get from nature. So this is the second lesson from the Chola administration system. The third and the final lesson from the Chola administration system was that in those days, like today, in any culture for that matter, we tend to go to places of worship to strike deals with our God, right? Do this for me and I will give you something, or I will do something for you in return. And in those days, about 1,000 years back, when the Cholas were at the height of their power, most of the people, when they went to temples and they had a vow to fulfill, just like today we might light a candle, they would sponsor a lamp to the temple, an oil lamp. And usually the oil lamp would look something like this next to the pillar. You can see that little stone column with a lamp on the top. You would place some oil inside, and then a wick, and then light the wick. The temple will say, thank you very much for the lamp, but it will also say, hey, you think you're doing us a favor, but actually you're making it a more difficult job for us, because it's not just the lamp, right? It's the wick, it's the cleaning, and it becomes a recurring expenditure. So the devotee will say, okay, I'm going to give you goats or cows or buffaloes or something, and there's usually a count. There's 95 goats, 12 cows, or 6 buffaloes. They'd have a count like this, and he'd say, use these. But the temple will come back and say, this is complicating the problem. We run a dairy, we don't run a temple. So the another person will be allocated to look after the animals. And anyway, the devotee will specify how many hours his lamp has to burn, and he could decide anything that he want, 1 day, 1 year, 24/7, whatever it was. So the animal would be milked. That milk would be made into butter. The butter would be made into ghee or clarified butter, and that would be used for the lamp. This contract would be drawn out, and there would be, and it would, in today's context, and I'd love to do this as a Q&A, but we can't do it today because you're on mute. We would typically look at only these three parties to the contract. The fourth party to the contract is the animal. So the animal's welfare will also be taken care of. The same cow can't be milked the same 2 consecutive days. If the cow is calved, the calf has to get the milk, not the temple, etc., etc. And so what I'm trying to say is, because of this, in this agreement, we see that the rights of every party, even a party which has no rights or may not be able to even articulate its rights, that party's need is also taken care of. And the man will always never be in the same village the temple is in. He'll always be in a close by village, so that the wealth can be distributed. And what that man would be allowed to do is, he has to give the clarified butter that's needed for the lamp. The rest of the milk he can sell. So because of that one devotee's lamp, a whole economy will be thriving in another village, and they would never bring that person to live in the same village, because that way they would actually distribute the wealth. And in doing that distribution, they actually avoided the kind of urban poverty that we see in all our large cities today, in a way, because our cities today have become parasites to the local, to the countryside. We hardly contribute much to the countryside, but we only consume from there, and in that way our development has been lopsided. So this was the third thing that they did, which is that you and I should live well today and tomorrow and forever. And the forever meant not just a win-win, because a win-win is you and me. It's a win for the community around us, nature, animals, anything that can't even articulate its rights, may not even have rights in the traditional sense of the word. We need to look at their welfare as well, not just in the short term, but in the long term as well. So this is the third principle that we have from the Chola kings. So just wanted to summarize again before we move on. When we look at history as needs and fears being eternal and universal, the lens becomes very different for us to look at how we can learn from history. Now, one empire that we can learn from a lot are the Cholas, because in terms of quantity, in terms of quality, in terms of financial efficiency, they have survived with a legacy that has existed positively for more than 1,000, 2,500 years after they have no longer been there. And we also know from the Chola period, we have their administrative, political, social, economic, and judicial records through inscriptions on the temples. And all of these are about disputes being resolved. So when we look at the pattern of disputes being resolved, three things come up. The first is, they had a very high level of recognition that people are different, that the more you delegate power, the more you allow local villages to be autonomous, the more harmonious civilization will be. The second they always looked at was, what can I do for other people, rather than look at what can I get from other people. The third thing they looked at is, they looked at finding a way to balance out the needs of all the people concerned, whether they could articulate it or not, and look at the environment as well, in the short term and in the long term. So with this, we come to the end of the Chola part, and we go on to our bonus. Right? Russian history has always fascinated me as a child. The Romanov dynasty came in at about 1613, at which time there was a lot of chaos and confusion in Russia at that point of time, and they went all the way to get this young boy called Michael. Mikhail, who was from the Romanov, he was a wealthy boyar, which meant he was a wealthy landowning class, and he became the first Romanov emperor of Russia in 1613. And then you have great rulers after that, like Peter the Great and Catherine and others. I think that's a time up notice for me. I'm going to finish pretty soon. And eventually it ended with Tsar Nicholas II. That's him in the picture, with his wife standing in the back, when they were brutally assassinated in 1918. And that's how the communists came to power in Russia. The Romanovs and especially Nicholas II, is an absolutely fascinating example of how not to behave in a crisis. And he did exactly the thing. The first thing that we learned from the Cholas, he did exactly the opposite, and that's what caused him to die, his family to die, and the entire dynasty to collapse as well. So when Nicholas came to power, it was a shocking moment because he was only about 20 years old. He thought his father was going to live for a longer time. His father was taken sick, and his grandfather had been assassinated before that. So there was a lot of fear of the Romanovs. That was a time that increasingly Russia was finding it difficult to straddle a world that in Europe had become industrialized. Russia still remained medieval in its outlook, and they still had some aversion of slavery for the agriculturalists, which is called serfs. And that was in stark contrast to the fabulous wealth that Nicholas had. In fact, Nicholas at that point in time was probably the most wealthiest person in the world, and they had massive palaces like this across Russia. This is from St. Petersburg. The gifts that they gave to each other were these kind of jeweled eggs, which were made by the court jeweler Fabergé. And you should go and have a look at much more information about them. And some of their jewels were fabulously legendary. So this is a tiara that belonged to one of the Russian Roman nobility, which was later bought over by Queen Elizabeth II. And there are many, many other jewels like this. So they lived in absolute opulence, splendor, and it was always medieval in the way. And you can see even today, if you go to palaces like St. Petersburg, and you can actually just about see it here, you had parts of the palace plated with gold. And the Tsar was still seen as not just a representative of God, but God himself. And starting from that, and here's a picture of Nicholas II and Alexandra. All the stones that they have on their clothes are precious stones, and you can see that fabulous emerald over there. And it is said that the crown that she was wearing for this costume ball was so heavy that she couldn't even turn her neck. That was how much of jewelry there was. And it all ended in 1918 when the entire family was shot to death in this room. And these are the bloodstains and the gunshot wounds that they have. So what happened, right? What happened? What happened to this fabulously wealthy Nicholas II? Such a gentleman, very, very conscientious, very deeply sincere. He comes to power at a time when he is God for the people. People would have done anything that he wanted, and yet this was the gruesome end that he had. And when he died, the communists came to power, and the whole face of Russia changed completely. What happened at that time was when World War II started, Russia was loyal to its allies, and it went on to fight on the side of Britain and France against Germany. And it was a tough decision to make because at that time, Russian Tsar, who was Nicholas II, he was connected by marriage to both the German king and the British king as well. And they were actually fighting on opposite sides now. And his wife, Alexandra, was actually a niece or a cousin of the German king. So it was a very tough decision to make, but they had no qualms about it. But it was also a risky decision to actually even go to war, because just a couple of years before that, the Russians had been severely humiliated by the Japanese. And remember, that was a time when Asia was considered inferior to Europe. So one was, of course, an Asian country defeating a European country, but that to a small country like Japan defeating a large, massive country like Russia. And remember, Russia was much larger than it is today. So Estonia, Latvia, Poland, parts of Finland, all of this was also part of Russia at that time. Despite that defeat, they went on to fight, and they could not have made a worse decision, because Russia had not even had industrial revolution. Most of its army were peasants. They weren't even properly equipped. They were fighting with spears and sticks and lances when the Germans already had the best guns at that point of time. And in a situation like this, very quickly they started getting defeated by the German army. Russian cold they couldn't manage at that point of time, and the countries immediately kind of spun into out of control, with bread becoming a major problem. Food shortages started happening, and there were protest marches in the capital city, which Nicholas felt was an affront to him being seen as God on earth. And there was some firing, people died. And this was also the time that his wife became completely under the spell of this holy man called Rasputin, and he was the one person who could keep the Tsarina or Nicholas's wife Alexandra calm, because they had a hemophiliac son. And hemophilia is a rare disease that shows up in men, but is transmitted through women. And what happens is, when internal bleeding doesn't stop, so even a cut on the skin can lead to the death of the patient. And it was vital for the heir to the throne to succeed, because in those days in Russia, only the boy could succeed, the girl could. And I think that must have really caused Alexander a lot of pain. So all of this, in this kind of a moment, Nicholas took the very questionable, wrong decision to take personal control of the army, and that in that way he actually signed his own death warrant. Because when he took personal control of the army, more and more the army when the defeats happened, they started being blamed on him. There were cliques in his family which started blaming Rasputin and his power through his wife, and that actually ended in the hastening of them being caught. And actually, there was a time when Nicholas abdicated the throne. He abdicated it in favor of his cousin. The cousin refused to take it up, and that's how the communists came into power. And when they came into power, one of the first things that they wanted to do was to capture Nicholas, so that he would not be seen as a rallying point for the forces. Because the communists said, Lenin said especially, that we need to have bread, land, and peace. So people need the bread, they need control of their land, and we need peace. So they were willing to negotiate and come to any agreement with Germany to stop the war, and that's what he did. And that was the time when they captured Nicholas and his family. They put him into house arrest. They moved him across to different places, and finally in 1918, in the small hours of the morning, they shot his entire family to death. So
Pradeep?
Nicholas, yeah, are we done?
Yeah.
Almost.
I mean, there's a lot of nice comments are coming. So maybe
Okay.
if you could quickly wrap, and we
We're
have
just going
some
to do that.
time for Q&A.
So basically, the point that I wanted to say was, if you want to look at how do we manage performance, right? Performance is about getting the task done and the relationships. So if you look at the way the Cholas did their administration, if you look at the way what Nicholas did not do, was they tended to focus on the relationships, and that allowed the tasks to get done. I think therefore, the principle of the Chola administration says is, if we tend to control too much, which is what Nicholas did, and he shouldn't have done that. If we tend to aggregate responsibility to ourselves, it becomes Ranabhumi. Rana is literally blood. So it becomes a bloodbath, which is actually what happened in Russia because of Nicholas. But if you're able to look at the diversity of the people, look at a way to bring the rainbow together, which is what Ranga is. You will be able to create a Ranga Bhumi, which is where you can create an earth full of differences and yet similarities as well. So these are the few things that I wanted to say. These are the three big points that I wanted to put up. I think all of you, we'll do a couple of questions now. But in any case, I do workshops on this, and I'm available on email for further conversations as well. So that's where I want to end. I would like you to take a second to look at these three and decide on which one of these will be the most important for you, in order for you to fulfill your own destiny and live up to that legacy in the numbers that you had decided in the beginning of the program. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Pradeep, for this brilliant session, and I can see some wonderful comments. We all can put on the video, and if anybody wants to share, what a delightful session this was, and the compare and contrast is something that many have enjoyed, and between the two empires, and also love the connection between the history and the current context. Thank you so much. So if anyone wants to share comments, insights, or questions for Pradeep, feel free.
I have a question about the Chola dynasty. So, what led to its eventual shift out of power, and the next chapter started? Was there anything
Right.
particular?
It's always the same story, Jill. Um, Two or three of the Chola kings were really on top of their job. They did their job well. They did all of the things that I said. And then slowly, some of the kings started becoming a lot more interested in art and culture. And they forgot that as a king, their first job was to take care of their people. And they kind of didn't stick to their knitting. They didn't focus on what they're supposed to do. And that meant that when they didn't take care of the people, agricultural income dwindled. And when agricultural income dwindled, they didn't have the taxes to pay the army, and they didn't focus on keeping the army up to date, which meant that kingdoms around vied for their position, and they were smarter and more agile, and they took over from them.
Colin, do you want to say something? Yes, Bala, go ahead. You are on mute. Can you just put on your volume? Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, Pradeep. Thanks for that wonderful session.
Thank you, Doctor.
Uh, when did the Cholas first get into power? You said they were there for 1,000 years?
Yeah, they were there actually for a much longer period of time. But we know of the early Cholas from about 2,000 years back, and that comes to us only from literary sources. So really, the imperial Cholas that we know about from the historical epigraphic sources, or from inscriptions and the details on the administration, we really know about them only from about 1,500, 1,600 years back. So they're a much older dynasty. Yes, that's right. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah.
Yes, Adit.
Hello, sir. I have a doubt. Before when the Cholas came to power in AD 0102, they had good kings. What made their downfall in the 480 to almost 900 AD? What was their downfall, and how did they go up again in the 900 ADs?
So that's a good question. Again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier, Adit, that at the time that you mentioned, the Chola kings they weren't seen in that period. Kings were powerful only if they had alliances with local landlords or local rulers. So they had local chieftains as well. And these chieftains would support the king in terms of giving them an army whenever they had for battle. And at that point of time, the Pallava kings, the Pallava rulers, and the Pandyas became more powerful, and they were able to defeat the Cholas. And then eventually, the Pallavas and the Pandyas become lazy again, and then the Cholas come back to power. So it's like this, right, Adit? I mean, and I can say this because my son's studying for his exams. If you study well for your exams, you tend to do your exams well, or you can be better prepared for googlies that you get. If you don't study for the exams, there's a chance that you might not do well. So if when kings were alert, when they were careful about doing what they were supposed to do, when they were agile, when they were constantly changing, when they were constantly preparing and practicing, they did well. When kings became lazy, they became relaxed. They said, let's sit at home and do nothing. Then there were other kings who were smarter and more agile, and they won the war.
Oh, thanks.
Pradeep, there's a question from Colleen. She says, I wonder about the literacy of the people during the 300, during this empire, the literacy of the people.
Good question, Colleen. So it is very likely that many people may not have been able to read and write, but it is very sure that all of them were very knowledgeable, especially with maths. And the way education would have been done traditionally in India, and this is not true just in the Chola Empire, this is true even about 300 years, 200 years back, is every community would impart the occupational skills that were needed for that community to their group. So today we have carpenters, plumbers, etc. separately in India. That would have been one group of Kaikolars, which is a caste. And this caste, they would have had no option but to teach all their children the tasks that were important for them. So everybody would have had one basic level of math. But the carpenters or the asaris or the gold jewelers, all of them, they were one group of people. They would have had highly specialized knowledge of their own trade. So it didn't it didn't matter if I didn't know how to read and write, because every evening people would tell stories to each other. And while the upper caste people might have been able to read the Ramayana as a Sanskrit text, there would have been versions of the Ramayana or the Mahabharata that would have been there for other castes as well. And again, the story would be not so much the focus on the detail, but fundamentally what is the root story of the root moral of the Ramayana, for example. Don't touch what is not yours. If you do bad, if you grab from somebody, you will come into a sticky end, right? Respect somebody else's property. Basic 3 rules, which is what any agricultural economy will need. Similar insight from the Mahabharata. Basically, it says keep your word, right? If you don't keep your word, bad things will happen to you. Ultimately, violence doesn't sort out everything. At the end of the day, in the Mahabharata, one group wins over the other. But if you read the last few chapters, the victors are also left with a lot of gloom and doom. So they used it's about, I think there are certain values that are important if we have to live in an agricultural community where we need to live together. How do I communicate these values? Through stories, through sculptures, etc., etc.
Bhavani, do you want to ask your question? Maybe you can unmute and ask. You have posted a question there. And then we can come to Palvi and we can close it. That could be the last one.
Well,
Yes.
thank you, Lakshmi. Well, that was the question that I kind of wanted. I, being an history teacher myself, I love when we come across with the chapter about Chola. So, unfortunately, many of the, I would be very practical, many of the South, North Indian, part of states are very much, kind of far away with the concept about Southern Indian history. So that's what a question. So these are some common questions which even I have posted in the group, that temple plays a very important role in the education system to build a culture. So in Chola Empire, it was one of the most important thing. And I guess Mr. Pradeep had answered the question that I was looking for. So really, I do appreciate. It was a very beautiful session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bhavani. So two things, it's not just the Cholas, many other kingdoms also use the temple as a way to fulfill their agenda, which
Agreed.
is why we have so many temples, to be honest, right? And the second thing that I wanted to also say is hopefully in another year or two, my book on South Indian history for children will be out. So
Well,
that
that's
part of the
good to
problem should
know.
also get sorted out.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, we've been discussing a bit about how our history books have been very Delhi centric, and that it's
Absolutely.
Yes.
been raised as a very big concern, and a lot of historical happenings have been completely skipped out. Pallavi, if we can go for you, and then we close it.
All right, perfect. Thanks, Lakshmi. Pradeep, congratulations for this insightful session. And my there's one thing that I mentioned in the chat as well is for the Romanovs, I'd highly recommend watching The Last Tsars on
Oh, yeah.
Netflix. It's a brilliantly made series.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if is there a similar series or documentaries or any books that we could read about the Cholas, because this is
No, that's
something we'd
so
like to
sad.
share more.
See, the problem, Pallavi, is the advantage that the Romanovs have is the wealth of material from the personal part. You have Nicholas's diaries, you have
Right,
Alexandra's diaries,
right,
you have many of their cousins who survived the massacre of the Bolsheviks. They came
right,
back to Europe and they wrote biographies, autobiographies. So you have a lot
right.
of information. You don't have that kind of stuff about the Cholas. But listen, but the thing is, Pallavi, if you start looking at it from the lens of needs and fears being eternal, right?
Right. Hmm.
Manu Pillai, for example, I think it's Manu, right? Yeah, he's written a
Oh yeah,
wonderful
Manu
book called
Pillai.
Ivory
Yeah.
Throne, which is on the
Right.
Travancore Kings, right? And I know there's somebody in Pune who's written quite a few books on the Peshwas, some
Right.
brigadier colonel, somebody, I can't remember his name now, but he's done a great
Right.
job. So and you can find a lot more information. So by the way, the last official imperial descendant of the Romanovs. She actually died in Canada, in Ontario, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
Yeah, it was Nicholas's aunt, Xenia. She died in Canada. Yeah.
Right. So basically, some more digging when it comes to that, and we find other leaders as well.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sunita, are you saying something? Your mic is muted. Yes.
There's a last question or comment by Reggie. Maybe we shall just give him the last word before we wrap.
Sure.
Yeah. Reggie says, we say what happens in the West, the East follows later. He asks you, with your knowledge of culture, hence behavior and history, does it remain so?
I can't follow the question. What was that again?
Reggie, are you there? Would you like to articulate your question?
Oops, Pradeep dropped out of the meeting.
Oh.
He will join.
Okay. Reggie, are you there?
Reggie's there. Could see him, but he's on.
He says, I can't unmute. Your question is not too clear, Reggie. Unfortunately,
sorry, what was that, Sunita? I couldn't hear the question clearly.
Yes, unfortunately, he cannot unmute. So I just read you his question. He says that what happens in the West, the East follows later. With your knowledge of HR, hence behavior and history, does it remain so? I don't know what he meant by that.
I'm not sure of what that means.
Yeah.
But I can say that across history, everybody makes the same mistakes. Yeah. Right. The first ruler is very careful, very prudent, very ambitious, very agile, works hard, very focused, and then it kind of sticks on for another one or two dynasty, for one or two generations. Third or the fourth generations becomes very chilled out, relaxed. They don't focus on what they should, and then somebody else takes over. And it's not very different in family-run businesses either.
Sure.
The same thing.
Yeah, that's
history,
a very
history tends to repeat itself.
Yeah, that's a very befitting kind of a global context of how history repeats itself and how history is in terms of, the context is very universal.
Yep.
Yeah.
And believe me, I mean, across the East and the West, human beings were not very different.
Yeah. Thank you, Pradeep, for this wonderful
Thank you very much.
And over to you, Jim. If there are any announcements for the next year.
So as of now, we'll be looking for some good webinars. I do know, actually, I believe the first webinar of 2021 will be one that I conduct based on the presentation that I gave for CATAR USA in October. So we had uncomfortable conversations in tough rooms. And I interviewed a variety of interculturalists and DEI practitioners across the world and asked them to share the toughest question that they had ever been asked in a live session. So I have around 12 stories from around the world to share on their behalf. So that will be the first webinar, and when we release the dates, of course, everyone will be informed via our mailing list, and we're also looking for presenters for webinars coming up. So if you're interested, or if you know someone that you think would like to participate in our webinar series for 2021, please do let us know. Drop us a mail at the CATAR India inbox. It's caatarindia@gmail.com. Other than that, the feedback link is in the chat box. So the feedback survey is here. I'll post it once more for easy viewing, the last chat. So we would appreciate if you could complete the survey feedback. And I think on behalf of everyone, again, thank you so much, Pradeep, for a lovely, lovely session. Fabulous way to end our series for 2020. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And have a lovely,
Yes.
lovely.
Let's hope 2020 will be history soon.
Yeah.
Let's hope that COVID will be history soon.
Yeah. Absolutely. All right then. Bye-bye.